So first, let's discuss the situation of a positive energy balance or imbalance to be more accurate. This is also referred to as an energy or caloric surplus since there is more fuel and therefore energy intake and availability than what is needed and thus expended. So an energy surplus would tip the balance this way as you see in this figure. Now, the most common way for one to achieve an energy surplus and thus a positive energy imbalance is through what we call overnutrition, which can also be termed overfueling to be more simplistic since nutrients are fuel for our cells and therefore our body. So overnutrition refers to a state in which we supply our body with more fuel and thus energy than what is needed. So as a result, there will be a surplus of energy. Now, because we are biological organisms that are made to survive, like most biological organisms, and since fuel and energy is required to survive, when there is a surplus of fuel/energy, the body likes to hold on to it. It will hold on to a surplus of energy in some endogenous form of fuel. Remember, endogenous just means inside our body, inside our tissues and our cells. These include endogenous carbohydrates or fat, mostly. Carbohydrate stores are referred to as glycogen and can be stored in various cells in the body, especially lean tissue like skeletal muscle. And endogenous fat stores primarily include triacylglycerol, aka triglyceride, which is largely found in adipose, more specifically your adipose cells or adipocytes. Now, one key point is that carbohydrate storage is limited, but fat storage is more expandable because of adipose tissue being a good fuel reserve tank, meaning this reserve tank called adipose is highly expandable because its cells, the adipocytes or adipose cells, are very expandable and thus can hold a relatively large amount of fat molecules, your triglycerides or triacylglycerol molecules. So with that said, whenever there is a surplus of energy through the fuel you consume through your nutrition, the body likes to store it in our fuel reserve tank, adipose, in the form of fat. Now let's focus on this third bullet point here. So we talked about how tipping the balance either way is a stressor to the body, and the body will have an acute or immediate, this is the key term here, acute or immediate response to this unbalancing to re-establish balance, or in other words, energy homeostasis. Your body, when you're in an energy surplus, will immediately try to flatten this out again. So as an acute response, so an immediate response to overfueling and therefore an energy surplus, the body will attempt to re-establish energy homeostasis by targeting the right side of this balance. So to re-establish an energy balance or homeostasis in the situation of an energy surplus, the body will immediately reduce the fuel and thus energy intake, again, to flatten this out. How? This is going to happen through what we call an anoresogenic response. And that's spelled right here. An anoresogenic response simply means hunger suppression or decreased appetite. This is largely mediated through the neuroendocrine system. The gut literally communicates with central command, our brain. And this is to diminish signals of hunger and increase signals of satiety. This is to encourage you to stop eating. This is the anoresogenic response. We've all experienced this. We consume too much beyond what we subjectively know as our needs, and we don't feel hungry anymore. So again, to summarize, the acute or immediate response to an energy surplus to re-establish energy homeostasis or balance is to reduce fuel and thus energy intake through an anoresogenic response, which is, in summary, anti-hunger and pro-satiety. Please make note of that. So the acute response to a positive energy balance is reducing the right side of the balance because, again, tipping this balance either way, in this case this way, is a stressor to the body. Again, this is an immediate response. This is not an adaptation or a long-term response to an energy surplus. It's an immediate acute response. Okay, so what happens if we ignore this anoresogenic response and continue to overfuel our body over an extended period of time? In other words, this positive energy imbalance is sustained. We generally know that we will gain weight because the surplus of energy that we consume will be stored up largely in fat molecules, which in turn will be stored mainly in adipose. The question is, how does our body adapt to this stressor of a positive energy imbalance sustained over time? How does it reestablish energy homeostasis if the acute anoresogenic response does not successfully reestablish energy homeostasis? Which side of this balance do you think will be targeted? Let's take a look. Now in this figure, we have three components. On the left is energy/fuel intake. In the middle, we have energy storage as fuel molecules in a variety of tissues, mainly lean and adipose tissues. And on the right, we have basal or resting metabolic needs or expenditure, which again makes up the majority of your total energy needs and expenditure, about 60%. So as we overfuel, we end up with an energy surplus, tipping the balance to the right and thus creating a positive energy imbalance. We can see here our fuel or energy intake exceeds our minimum energy/fuel needs. So where does this surplus of energy get stored? Well, like I said earlier, your body likes to store energy in an energy-dense fuel molecule called fat, particularly a fat molecule called triacylglycerol or triglyceride. These fat molecules are largely stored in adipose cells, which are almost 90% fat. Remember, adipose is known as your body's fuel reserve tank. So because a surplus of energy and thus fuel is being stored in adipose, we see an increase in adipose size and mass as shown in the middle here. You may also notice that lean tissue like muscle does not really experience much change in size and mass during an extended period of energy surplus. Why? Well, it's because lean tissue like muscle is not necessarily a good fuel reserve tank because it does not have a high capacity to store fat or excess energy or excess fuel rather. It does, however, have a high capacity to store carbohydrate fuels in the form of glycogen, but like I said, glycogen storage is limited compared to fat storage. So this is why lean tissue like muscle doesn't necessarily increase in size and mass, at least significantly, during situations of prolonged overfueling. Okay, here's the thing. Many people think weight gain is the adaptation to a prolonged energy surplus. It is not. Weight gain, or more specifically, a gain in adipose tissue mass and size, is just an effect of a prolonged energy surplus. You're just dumping more stuff, excess stuff, fuel, into adipose tissue. Remember, adaptations are specific to the stress imposed on the body. So if the stress is a positive energy imbalance, the adaptation is meant to counter that. So how does the body adapt to a prolonged state of energy surplus and positive energy imbalance? It's by increasing the body's basal or resting energy needs/expenditure. In other words, as an adaptation to prolonged energy surplus, the body will increase its basal metabolic rate or resting energy expenditure/needs. And this is to the point where it generally matches how much energy you consume. So once this adaptation is complete, there is now no more positive energy imbalance. There is no more surplus. At this point, energy homeostasis or balance is reestablished, and there is no more surplus and thus no more weight gain. More specifically, no more increase in adipose mass. So relating this back to the energy balance model, when there is a positive energy imbalance as shown here and thus energy surplus, The acute response to reestablish energy balance or homeostasis is by reducing the right side, the fuel/energy intake, through again what we call an anoresogenic response, a hunger suppression. But if the anoresogenic response is ignored and the energy surplus is sustained over time, the body will then target the left side of this balance to reestablish energy homeostasis. Obviously, to rebalance this by targeting the left side, you would have to increase the left side to match the right side. And as I said in the prior slide, the body adapts to a prolonged energy surplus by increasing resting energy needs or basal metabolic rate or BMR until total energy needs/expenditure matches the total energy intake and availability. This is one form of adaptive thermogenesis. As a result, the energy balance is reestablished, as you see right here. Now, during this period of adaptation, this surplus of energy is stored as fat molecules in adipose mainly, and you have weight gain. But with the same caloric intake, we know the rate of weight gain will diminish over time and eventually plateau. Why? Because, again, of adaptation. The caloric intake initially created a high energy surplus, which thus stimulated weight gain. But as you adapt to this now habitual caloric intake by increasing the BMR or resting energy expenditure, that caloric intake is no longer a surplus. It now matches your energy needs. And when the caloric intake now matches the needs and expenditure, there is no more imbalance and no more surplus. You actually become a calorie burning machine. But at the same time, you also have increased adiposity. So with that, you have to understand that obese individuals compared to leaner counterparts of lesser mass actually have a very high metabolic rate, which seems counterintuitive. Many people say that obese or overweight individuals have a slow metabolism or low basal metabolic rate. This is a complete myth. That is not true. It is quite the opposite. And now we know why. Weight-stable, obese individuals have high adiposity because they were in an energy surplus at one point. They gained weight because of that, and they eventually stopped gaining weight because of adaptation to the energy surplus, which again is an increase in basal metabolic rate or resting energy expenditure/needs. So it is suffice to say that obese individuals do have a relatively high total energy expenditure, since BMR or resting energy expenditure accounts for 60% of it. Now, in a study I did previously in morbidly obese individuals who are anywhere from 300 to 500 pounds, I assessed their resting energy expenditure. It is a procedure that we do here in my lab as well. They sit inside an enclosure and we collect respiratory gases for a few hours and use that data to estimate their resting energy expenditure or basal metabolic rate. Now, with these subjects, their resting energy expenditure and thus needs were anywhere from 3,500 to 5,000 calories per day. Let's say they expend 1,000 calories a day in addition through activity and diet-induced thermogenesis. So their total energy expenditure and therefore needs was about 4,500 to 6,000 calories per day, meaning they can consume 4,500 to 6,000 calories per day and stay weight stable. This is what I mean by being a calorie burning machine when you are obese. So what is the silver lining in all this? What is the upside to being obese? Well, obese individuals have a very high propensity for weight loss because they burn a lot of calories by simply existing. So they can lose a lot of weight by just restricting some calories. Okay, to summarize this slide, the main takeaway is that during a state of prolonged positive energy balance and energy surplus, there will be weight gain as the energy is stored in endogenous fuels, which are largely fat molecules stored in adipose mainly. Our body will, however, adapt to this energy surplus by intervening on the left side of this balance to reestablish energy homeostasis. It will do so by increasing resting energy needs or resting energy expenditure or basal metabolic rate. And thus total energy expenditure would be increased. This adaptation is referred to as adaptive thermogenesis. It is one form of adaptive thermogenesis. Once adaptation causes the resting energy expenditure / needs to roughly match the habitual energy intake, energy homeostasis will be reestablished and weight will be stabilized since there is no longer any surplus. You must understand that this adaptation must happen, otherwise you will continue to increase energy storage and expand tissue and the body mass endlessly. Now, some may also ask, well, what happens to the anoresicogenic response, those hunger suppression signals over time as you adapt? Well, those anoresicogenic responses or those signals will also diminish with adaptation. Those anoresicogenic signals are positively correlated with energy surplus. So when the energy surplus diminishes over time with adaptation, the anoresicogenic signals also diminish. So there is less inhibition to you eating as you gain weight and as you adapt to that energy surplus. The anoresicogenic signals, therefore, are much more intense initially as you experience an energy surplus. All right, so let's now talk about what happens during the opposite condition. What we see here now is a negative energy imbalance in which the total energy needs / expenditure exceeds the total energy intake and availability. This is often caused by something called undernutrition, or more simply, underfueling. This is more commonly referred to as energy or caloric restriction. Now, this energy imbalance is thus reflective of an energy or caloric deficit. So a caloric or energy deficit is the opposite of an energy surplus. Now, during an energy deficit, since the total energy intake is restricted, the body will have to rely on endogenous fuels like those stored in adipose, fat molecules, for example. This is so that the body can meet its energy needs. So this means your body during an energy deficit is largely relying on your endogenous energy stores. So just like an energy surplus state, this is a stressor to the body. Again, tipping this balance is a stressor, and thus the body will immediately or acutely respond to reestablish energy balance or homeostasis. So what side of this balance do you think your body will target acutely or immediately in response to an energy deficit to reestablish energy homeostasis? So just like the other condition, your body will again target the right side of this balance immediately in response to an energy deficit, again to reestablish balance in the scale. So how does your body do that? Now remember, as an acute response to an energy surplus, we indicated earlier that there will be a hunger suppression signal referred to as an anoresicogenic response or signal. And this is again to immediately reestablish energy homeostasis. Well, in the case of an energy deficit, you would expect the acute response to reestablish energy homeostasis to be the opposite. Your body immediately tries to reestablish energy homeostasis during an energy deficit by what we call an oresicogenic response. And this is together with an anti-anoresicogenic response. So we have oresicogenic signals together with anti-anoresicogenic signals. Now, oresicogenic means hunger or appetite stimulating. So it encourages eating. Remember, anoresicogenic is the opposite. So an anti-anoresicogenic response simply means anti-satiety. So an oresicogenic and anti-anoresicogenic response together induces hunger and encourages you to eat so you can raise the right side of this balance by increasing energy intake. This, again, is an immediate acute response to the stress imposed by an energy deficit. So let's take a look at the oresicogenic response. Remember, I said earlier, hunger and satiety is regulated largely through the neuroendocrine system and involves communication between the gastrointestinal system and the central nervous system, the brain. So here is one example of an oresicogenic mechanism, a hunger or appetite stimulating mechanism. During an energy deficit, there is an increased release of a gut hormone called ghrelin. Ghrelin is mainly released by cells of the stomach into blood circulation and is also released in small amounts by cells of the small intestines and the pancreas. Its release is largely stimulated by the absence of nutrients in the gastrointestinal tract. So, for example, when you are restricting food intake. So, during an energy deficit, usually one is restricting food intake and thus a lower than usual presence of nutrients in the gut. So, as an immediate response to an energy deficit, there is an increased release of ghrelin into blood circulation. Ghrelin then interacts with the hypothalamus gland in the brain area, which increases the release of a neuropeptide called NPY, neuropeptide Y. Now, NPY acts like a neurotransmitter, which is a potent stimulator of appetite. This is why ghrelin is referred to as a hunger hormone. And together, ghrelin and NPY are orexigenic factors. They stimulate appetite or hunger. Now, this is one example of an orexigenic response. There are other mechanisms that are orexigenic that stimulate appetite and hunger. So, in summary, if I ask the question, which of the following describes the immediate acute stress response to an energy deficit, the answer would be an orexigenic and anti-anorexigenic response, with one example being the ghrelin NPY mechanism. This is an example of an orexigenic signal. I may also ask which side of the energy balance is the primary target for the immediate acute response to an energy deficit to reestablish energy homeostasis. It would be the right side, total energy intake / availability. More specifically, your body will try to encourage you to increase the right side, increase energy intake to rebalance this scale. Okay, so now we understand what our body does as an immediate acute response to the stress of an energy deficit. And this alludes to why it's difficult sometimes to maintain an energy or caloric deficit. It's not just psychological, it's psychophysiological. These signals telling you to eat are generated by your body because it is responding to a stress. So essentially, when you are trying to cut weight and restricting calories, your own body is fighting against your goals. But you know, if you can overcome these orexigenic, anti-anorexigenic signals, these hunger signals, the signals will eventually diminish. And some people say that it's because you just get used to the caloric deficit. To some sense, this is true. You do adapt as you would to an energy surplus. More on that in a few. But first, we have to understand that during an energy deficit, as we said, your body will rely heavily on endogenous fuel stores to meet its energy needs, and this is what contributes to the actual loss of body mass, more specifically, adipose tissue mass. Remember, going back to the car analogy, as your container called adipose is getting rid of the stuff inside called fat molecules in the form of CO2 and H2O, and the container not being refilled with fuel since you are now underfueling yourself, the cells and therefore tissue will eventually decrease in size and mass. This whole process can be generally broken down into 4 parts. First, we have changes at the gene level. Remember, we talked about gene expression earlier and that certain genes that control metabolism can be switched on and off in response to a stressor or some extrinsic factor. So in response to an energy deficit, especially if sustained over time, key genes that play a regulatory role in fat metabolism starts to change in expression. As a result, at the molecular level, an energy deficit would increase the rate of fat catabolism and oxidation to help the body meet its energy needs. Thus, the fuel inside adipose cells that make up the size and mass of that cell are broken down. They are catabolized, and then they are mobilized to various cells in the body. And then those cells oxidize those fat molecules for its energy needs. And then those fat molecules are converted to H2O and CO2 and eventually expelled from the body. Over time, as this continues to happen under an energy deficit, the cells, in particular adipose cells, start to change. Because there's less intracellular fat content now in these adipose cells, the adipose cells start to atrophy. They decrease in size and mass. When there is sufficient atrophy of a significant amount of adipose cells, the adipose tissue demonstrates observable reductions in size and mass, eventually manifesting in changes in body composition and overall body mass. So you can see here there is a lot that needs to happen during an energy deficit in order to get to this fourth level right here, to see observable changes in the whole body. So this is why reaching your weight loss goals usually takes a significant amount of time. We are talking about a net loss of a few grains of sand from the container each and every day. An observable and measurable loss of container mass will take time until a sufficient amount of sand has been removed from the container. We will come back to this, but let's talk about the process of reducing adipose mass during an energy deficit. Okay, first, let's talk about what is happening inside the adipose cells during an energy deficit. More specifically, what is happening to the fat fuel molecules that are stored within those adipose cells, namely triglycerides or triacylglycerol. Overall, what is happening is increased fat catabolism, breaking down of these triglyceride molecules, these fat store molecules inside adipose cells. In other words, the fat molecules stored in adipose cells are being degraded into smaller constituents, namely those fatty acids. So the triglyceride molecules found in the fat pad or lipid droplets within the adipose cells are catabolized to individual free fatty acids. This process of breaking down the triglyceride molecule into its smaller constituents, this is called lipolysis. Lipo referring to lipids and lysis referring to degradation or catabolism. Lipolysis is mediated through a variety of signals, but largely through hormone signals. Now, during an energy deficit, there is an increased release of hormones that stimulate the catabolism of endogenous fuel stores like triglycerides in adipose cells. These include hormones such as glucagon, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. The latter two combined referred to as your catecholamines. So glucagon is released by the pancreas and the catecholamines are released by the adrenal gland and sometimes as a neurotransmitter. There are also other hormones involved, but let's just stick to the basics here. Let's just stick to these three right here. So these particular hormones are similar in the sense that they bind to very similar receptors on cells like on adipose cells. Catecholamines bind to beta-adrenergic receptors, which are similar to glucagon receptors. And these are membrane receptors as shown here. They are not only similar in structure, but also similar in one of the downstream signaling pathways. So the pathways that are downstream of this membrane receptor. Now, this signaling pathway involves the activation of adenylyl cyclase, which in turn increases cyclic AMP or CAMP. CAMP increases protein kinase A activation, which in turn will increase the activity of several enzymes that catalyze lipolysis called lipases. One is HSL or hormone-sensitive lipase, and the other is adipose triglyceride lipase. There is also an increase in the expression of a gene called ABHD5, which provides instruction for making a protein called 1-acylglycerol 3-phosphate O-acyltransferase. You do not need to memorize that. This would, in effect, turn on these lipases, especially ATGL. This is one example of changes in gene expression in response to an energy deficit. There's an increased expression of this gene, which gives rise to a particular protein, which promotes the activation of these lipases, especially ATGL. The gene expression changes increases lipolytic activity, the degradation of triglycerides or triacylglycerols, these fat store molecules within adipose cells. So as these triglycerides or triacylglycerol molecules are being catabolized, there is increased release and circulation of free fatty acids, which then can be mobilized to other cells, and those cells can oxidize them, and in that process, these fatty acids will be converted to CO2 and H2O. So again, all this is happening and elevated during an energy deficit to help meet the fuel and thus energy needs of the body, the various cells within the body. So in brief, as I mentioned earlier, the fatty acids can be mobilized to various cells in the body, and there it can be oxidized for energy through aerobic metabolism or oxidative phosphorylation, which as we know occurs inside the mitochondria of cells. Now through this process, as I said earlier in the car analogy, energy is released in the form of heat and in a form that is transferred to generate ATP. Now, the mass of the fatty acids, based on the law of conservation of mass, are conserved as it is being oxidized. In other words, the carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens that make up the mass of the fatty acid is conserved in the form of CO2 and H2O, which is later expelled from the body. CO2 in expiratory air and H2O mainly through urine and sweat. This is how the fat molecules, or at least the mass of the fat molecules, exit your body. So over time, as long as you maintain an energy deficit state, this increased catabolism and oxidation of fat will eventually result in adipose cell atrophy, or decrease in size and mass of an adipose cell, since the fat inside these cells are not being replaced because you have reduced your fuel intake and the storage of fuel in adipose is decreased. Now in these figures right here, you have cross sections of adipose cells, and you can see an example of atrophy before an energy deficit while going through an energy deficit. And this again is explained by reduced fat storage or fat content within these adipose cells. And over time, when there is significant atrophy of adipose cells, so when enough adipose cells undergo significant reduction in size and mass, you will have changes that are observed at the adipose tissue level and eventually the whole body level, as you see in this scan right here. And this can be measured through a variety of body composition assessments that are available. So as you can see, changes at the whole body level all start at the molecular level. So yes, there is a lot of work that needs to be done inside your cells in order for you to actually observe changes in your body composition. So going back to this figure here, we have to understand the scale of the weight loss process. It all starts at the molecular level. So you could imagine how much work needs to be done to see observable changes at this level here, which is what matters, the tissue and the whole body level. So this is a scientific justification for consistency and patience when it comes to weight loss. An energy deficit does not result in observable weight loss immediately. It will take time, as you can see by the scale of events that need to take place. Just because you can't see changes doesn't mean nothing is happening at the molecular and cellular levels. If a few adipose cells atrophy, you're not going to notice it. It will take time to manifest itself at an observable level, the tissue and whole body levels. Okay, so just to recap everything we discussed up to this point regarding weight loss, as you undergo an energy deficit and enter a negative energy imbalance, your body will immediately or acutely respond with an anorecogenic and anti-anorecogenic response to encourage you to eat and raise the right side of the balance, the energy intake and availability side, to meet your energy needs and to reestablish the energy balance or homeostasis. This again is an acute stress response. But say you ignore those acute orexigenic signals and you maintain this certain level of caloric restriction and therefore energy deficit for an extended period of time. You will lose weight, as I said earlier. But just like weight gain, weight loss is not the adaptation to a sustained energy deficit. It is simply the effect of it. We just lose weight because more fuel mass is leaving your body than coming in and being stored in our body. Simple as that. So what is the adaptation to a sustained energy deficit? You might be able to guess from our discussion on the adaptation to an energy surplus. Your body will eventually adjust to the caloric restriction because a restriction is causing an energy deficit, which creates a stress as described here. The stress imposed by an energy deficit is increased utilization of endogenous fuel or energy substrates, plus decreased intake of exogenous fuel or nutrients to refuel the body. This is a stress to the body because it challenges survival. If there is less energy coming in and the energy intake does not fulfill this energy need of the body, then yes, of course, this is going to challenge survival. So with that, over time during an energy deficit, the body will adapt. How? By reducing the energy needs of the body, largely through the suppression of resting energy expenditure/needs, which again is referred to as your basal metabolic rate, which again represents the minimum energy needs of the body to stay functioning. Once your body has fully adapted to your caloric intake, that caloric intake is no longer creating a deficit, and thus there is no more weight loss. This adaptation is therefore synonymous with weight plateau or weight stabilization. It is basically the complete opposite of the adaptation to a prolonged energy surplus. So going back to this animation we initially presented with the energy surplus discussion, we see again energy fuel intake on the left, energy storage in adipose and lean tissue in the middle, and resting or basal energy needs/expenditure on the right. When you underfuel and restrict calories below your needs, you create a deficit as you see here. This again is representative of a negative energy imbalance. The intake is below the needs. Because you are now relying heavily on endogenous fuels, you will see a decrease in the mass of not only adipose, but also lean tissue. This is different than what was happening with energy surplus. During an energy surplus, you only saw an increase in adipose mass, but not lean tissue. But with energy deficit, we see a reduction in both adipose and lean tissue mass. Why? Because during an energy deficit, not only are we tapping into our fat reserve fuels, which are largely stored in adipose, but we are also tapping into other endogenous fuels like carbohydrates, which are largely stored in lean tissue. But not only that, we are also tapping into proteins, more specifically the amino acids that make up proteins. Since lean tissue like skeletal muscle have relatively large protein content, it is common, especially with more severe energy deficits, to experience a reduction in muscle size and mass. Okay, so as I emphasized previously, this loss of tissue mass is not the adaptation to energy deficit. The adaptation, again, is specific to the stress. So the adaptation serves to reestablish energy homeostasis. So the adaptation here to a sustained energy deficit is a suppression of resting or basal energy expenditure/needs. And thus, the total energy needs of the body is decreased. The suppression of resting energy expenditure will proceed until it generally matches the energy intake and availability, thereby eradicating the energy deficit and reestablishing energy balance, as you see right here. So this is why the rate of weight loss decreases and eventually stabilizes as you are restricting calories. Over time, the caloric restriction will no longer be a restriction because your body has adapted to it. So some people wonder why they lost weight in the beginning of their new caloric intake, but now they have plateaued. Why do you think? Well, if the caloric intake remains the same as when they first started to lose weight, the body has adequately adapted to it, so the caloric intake is no longer creating a deficit, and thus there's no stimulus for further weight loss. So does this mean this individual needs to restrict more calories to create a deficit? Well, that's one way to do it, but in our last lecture series, we will talk about other ways to create an energy deficit, especially if you are already with a leaner body composition. Now, this figure here represents just that. As you can see on the left, this is when calories are restricted and a negative energy imbalance and thus energy deficit is created. This stimulates weight loss and an acute orexigenic response to reestablish energy homeostasis immediately. If you overcome the orexigenic response, meaning you ignore those hunger signals and maintain the caloric restriction, significant weight loss will occur and eventually adaptation will happen to reestablish energy balance or homeostasis. Again, this is done largely through the suppression of resting energy expenditure and needs. And thus, as you adapt, the deficit becomes smaller and smaller, eventually reestablishing energy homeostasis as you see here. This adaptation in your resting energy expenditure/needs is another form of adapted thermogenesis. When you have sufficiently adapted, this is when weight becomes stabilized since there is no more deficit even with the same caloric intake. So here's a simple practical example to help you conceptualize all this. Let's just say you are weight stable at 200 pounds with a daily intake of 3,000 kcals per day, which means since you are weight stable at 200 pounds, this means your daily energy needs/expenditure is around 3,000 kcals per day. Your intake and availability of energy meets your needs. So you want to lose weight, and thus you restrict your caloric intake to 2,500 kcals per day. This is an energy or caloric deficit of 500 kcals. Your needs and expenditure is, again, 3,000 while your intake is 2,500. You begin to lose weight because your body is relying heavily on your fuel stores and your tissues start to atrophy. During this energy deficit, over time, your body will adapt to get rid of this energy deficit and to reestablish energy homeostasis. Your body will suppress resting energy expenditure/needs. So as you adapt to this 2,500 kcal per day intake, what was once a 500 kcal per day deficit is now only a 300 kcal per day deficit because your energy needs and expenditure went from 3,000 to 2,800 kcals through this adaptive suppression of resting energy expenditure. Because now the deficit is smaller, the rate of weight loss is slower. Then eventually, as you keep adapting and resting energy expenditure/needs is further suppressed, your deficit to the 2,500 kcal per day is now only 100 kcals, as your body has now suppressed the energy expenditure/needs to 2,600 kcals per day. Eventually, with this 2,500 kcal per day diet, you will adapt to the point to which your total energy expenditure/needs is suppressed to 2,500 kcals per day. And thus, there is no more deficit and energy balance is re-established at this point. Now your new total energy needs/expenditure is about 2,500 kcals, which keeps you stable at a lower weight. So with that being said, weight loss is associated with a suppression of your basal or resting energy expenditure/needs. Now, this information has several implications. First, as you lose weight in response to an energy deficit, you should know that your resting energy needs and expenditure will decrease as an adaptation. So leaner individuals of smaller mass will generally have lower resting energy expenditure and needs than obese individuals of larger mass. Second, this means with more weight loss, the more difficult it is to lose weight because it becomes more difficult to create an energy deficit since the resting energy expenditure and needs have decreased significantly. And lastly, when you are weight stable, your average daily energy or caloric intake should generally match your daily energy needs, with 60% of that representing your resting energy expenditure and needs. Remember, the only reason you are weight stable is because both sides of the balance are equal. So whatever you are consuming in terms of calories or energy generally equals what you need in terms of calories or energy. So this is alluding to the importance of tracking your caloric intake when you want to lose weight. You first have to know how many calories on average per day is stabilizing you at that weight. Once you figure that out, now you have a baseline caloric intake to determine how much to restrict. Some people go into caloric restriction blindly thinking they are restricting, but in actuality, they are not. So weight stabilization is a good time to figure out what your current total energy needs are to help you determine how many calories you should consume to lose weight. So yes, adaptive thermogenesis to a sustained energy deficit has its pros and cons. Now, the pros of this suppression of resting energy needs and expenditure, or basal metabolic rate, in response to a sustained energy deficit is biological. It is to ensure survival. Imagine if your energy needs never adjusted to a lower energy intake. Your cells will eventually run out of fuel and thus energy. This is referred to as starvation, and starvation is conducive to death. So the pros to this suppression of resting energy expenditure slash needs is simply we don't die. So from a biological standpoint, this so-called slowing of our metabolic rate is a very, very good thing. Now the cons to an adaptive thermogenesis response to a sustained energy deficit is more sociological because, as we indicated earlier, this suppression of resting energy expenditure and needs minimizes the energy deficit, meaning a caloric intake that once created a deficit eventually won't create a deficit because the body has adapted to it. This makes continual weight loss more difficult to achieve. Also, you have to understand that your total energy expenditure and needs are reduced since resting energy expenditure accounts for 60% of it. This is, of course, if your level of physical activity remains constant. Thus, if you revert back to your prior pre-weight loss caloric intake, you will gain weight since your old caloric intake prior to weight loss is now going to create an energy surplus. The next question now is something that is unreasonably debated, especially on social media. Can a specialized diet help prevent adaptive thermogenesis, or this suppression of resting or basal metabolic rate during caloric restriction or energy deficit situations? The answer to this question is no. One of the biggest oxymorons in the weight loss industry is a metabolism boosting weight loss diet, quote unquote. A diet that induces weight loss is one that creates an energy deficit through caloric restriction. So knowing what you know now about physiology, metabolism, and just the science of the human body, how could a diet that induces weight loss also cause an increase in one's resting energy expenditure, or simply metabolic rate? That would be counterproductive to survival, as we should know by now. So as your body's fuel slash energy needs are not being met, you're telling me that this magic diet is not only going to make me lose weight, but further increase my body's fuel slash energy needs? If this actually occurred, you would die eventually since your cells would run out of fuel. So please never ever buy into this kind of hype or misinformation touted by the weight loss industry commonly. We will adapt to a lower caloric intake because an energy deficit is a stress to the body. The simple fact that we weight plateau after a period of weight loss to a specific caloric intake is evidence enough to suggest that adaptive thermogenesis, or suppression of basal metabolic rate, exists. So for the sake of brevity, I want to skip over to this slide here. We know there are numerous popular weight loss diets out there, and the question always comes up: does blank diet work? In terms of simply weight loss, the answer to that question is yes. But what is concerning is that many in the weight loss diet industry, or advocates of a particular weight loss diet, attribute the weight loss to some secret formula or effect on the body that is specific to this particular diet. So here in this table, I listed some popular weight loss diets that do indeed stimulate weight loss. Here are descriptions of each diet. The Atkins diet is extreme carbohydrate restriction. Ketogenic diet, high fat, high protein intake and carbohydrate restriction. Intermittent fasting, intermittent periods or days of fasting. Detox diets, basically starving yourself. Paleo diet, organic, non-processed Paleolithic foods with low caloric density. Hollywood diet, liquid diet that is borderline starvation. Very low calorie diet system, which is usually medically administered. This is 800 kcals per day. This is really meant for urgent clinical cases of obesity. So how do each of these diet systems stimulate weight loss? Not because of a magical effect or secret formula, but rather by creating an energy or caloric deficit. This is why in the scientific community, we never say that any caloric restrictive diet is inherently superior than another. The prerequisite to any diet that is intended to stimulate weight loss is a caloric deficit. Again, going back to the scientific basics that we went over in this lecture series, you need a fuel mass deficit to lose weight, as we have demonstrated in all those car analogies earlier. Calories is a measure of energy and a proxy for fuel mass. So therefore, a caloric or energy deficit is the only way to lose body mass. This is very important for my students to understand because I do not want any of you to be those individuals that say one diet is inherently superior than another in terms of weight loss because of some secret formula or some magical effect that it has on the body. You also have to understand that with this being said, as long as the diet creates an energy deficit, it will work. And thus, if you are looking for a structured diet program, then really the choice should be mostly predicated on which program you think you would best adhere to. Since I emphasized earlier, it will take time for an energy deficit to manifest itself in an observable loss of body mass, since it all starts with the mass of fuel molecules exiting your body at a rate greater than being stored in your body. So here are some bottom line practical points to conclude this lecture series. Number one, no matter what type of diet you follow, an energy or caloric deficit is required in order for a loss of body mass to occur. This is based on physical law. Number two, there are known and many unknown factors that differentiate people who respond positively to a certain diet versus someone who doesn't. There's not one research study that would tell you that one diet is inherently superior than another in terms of weight loss. The only prerequisite that we know for sure that will successfully induce weight loss is a diet that creates an energy/caloric deficit. Number three, for overweight and obese individuals with relatively high metabolic rates because, again, of adapted thermogenesis to a high caloric intake, energy deficit should just be the primary consideration for weight loss. Like I said earlier, overweight and obese individuals, again, with relatively high metabolic rates, have a large propensity for weight loss. So even with a relatively small caloric restriction, they would achieve significant weight loss. And number four, unique and more extreme or complex dietary methods, as well as exercise methods, which we'll talk about in our last lecture series, may demonstrate observable effects in leaner individuals who do not have a large propensity for weight loss because they don't have a high caloric intake to begin with. So these are situations of quote-unquote shredding or just losing a few pounds for the summer, for example. So going back to number three, like I said, if you are overweight and obese, you have a relatively high average daily caloric intake, and you are weight stable, this means that your metabolic rate is relatively high, again, because of adapted thermogenesis. And so you don't need to be too complex with your dietary methods. You can just simply figure out the easiest way to induce an energy deficit. This can just be reducing the amount of food that you consume on average in every meal. All right, so this concludes our lecture series on the metabolic aspects of body mass regulation / control. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me.